Nilipokuwa mdogo nilipewa hadithi kwamba Ulaya ni kama mbinguni. Nikatamani kwenda Ulaya. Sasa nimekomaa, ninaishi Ulaya, najionea Ulaya mwenyewe. Usione sipigi simu kila saa, na ninasema niko Ulaya.
Hi there! Welcome to episode 17 of Afrikanists Assemble. This month, we decided to tackle a subject that comes up a lot in discussions with people working with African languages: the official treatment of these languages in schools. Here's the question we pose to our contributors. Let's pretend that the Minister of Education of an African country comes to you and asks you to help develop a new language policy in the education system. Do you agree to help? If not, why not? If so, what sort of policies would you create? Here's what they had to say about that.
I would help in developing a language policy in Kenya. It is not exactly a new policy, but rather I feel like we should reinforce what we already have. English is the dominant language in Kenya, yet it is not a Kenyan language. Colonialism had a big effect on the languages in Kenya, and those effects have continued to linger more than half a century since independence. Kenya has 42 indigenous languages and one national language, Kiswahili. Although Kiswahili is widely used, English still remains the main medium of instructions in all Kenyan schools, while the indigenous languages go through language oppression. Slowly but surely, indigenous languages are going through extinction, mostly because of the overemphasis on English as an official language, but also due to intermarriages and urbanization. There is also a general myth that equates the knowledge and proficiency in the English language as a sign of literacy, which is a fallacy and which unfortunately is contributing to the near erasure of some Kenyan languages. What then is the way forward? Vernacular has been introduced in schools in the new curriculum, but I feel that it is not achieving the intended objectives. I would therefore advocate for an active language practice so that it is not just another subject in the curriculum, but it has to be encouraged to be actively used in schools, in homes, and in the streets. Learners should be encouraged to acquire their mother tongues before they are introduced to any other language. This, however, should be done in a way that ensures that Kenya is truly multilingual. To this end, learners should be encouraged to embrace not just their mother tongues, but other indigenous languages as well. To this end also, literacy materials should be published to ensure the success of this. If done properly, we might just prevent our indigenous language from total extinction, but we might also be able to finally restore national pride.
Let us pretend that the minister of an African country comes to me and asks me to help develop a new language policy in the education system. I certainly do agree. And this is an excerpt of my letter to the Honorable Minister of Education. Thank you very much for this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to contribute to the direction of education for the future generation of Africans. I am aware that this is a generation born during the period of using generators for power supply. They are the generation that has perfected the use of code switching and have upgraded it to a level that it earns millions for the individuals, if not for the nation. I will take as my compass the 2022 work of Dr. Bert Van Prinksteren on language and education in Africa. He devoted the third chapter to language policy and citizenship. There he presented a watertight argument that citizenship implies access to information and to political discourse in a language that is accessible to citizens. My Honorable Minister, need I add more? As you know, we are now at a junction in our development when it has become an imperative to include the learning and teaching of indigenous languages and those modes of communication imposed on our countries by former colonial terrorists and abductors. It is never too late to redesign our language policy to include both the local and the global. I can assure you of my willingness to participate in making this happen. Once the political will is there, the wheel of progress will roll. Yours sincerely, Kole. Keep on learning everywhere.
Should the Cabinet Secretary of Education in Kenya, by the way, we call our ministers Cabinet Secretaries, should this minister ask me to participate in a project of looking at the language policy in our education system, I really wouldn't have a choice in the matter. I would have to participate. I won't say much about this, only to indicate to you that this won't be because I am so hungry for some laurels that come with participation in these national projects that contribute to the development of the nation. That said, I generally hold that we have a fairly sensible language policy in our education system. It has its challenges, and to my opinion, most of these challenges are the consequences of historical processes. I give a simple example that there is a general assumption that children should be taught in the languages of the ethnicity that dominates the places where they inhabit in the early years of their schooling. Now, a lot has happened since this assumption held true. People move, the nation grows, the idea of a Kenyan nation, and the place of these kinds of languages then is modified so that it would be almost immoral to force a child of ethnicity X to have to learn the language of ethnicity Y in their formative years. And yet, this child of ethnicity X lives in a land that is said to belong to ethnicity Y. There are things like that. And then there is also the fact that we all have understood the value of Kiswahili and English, and we want the best for our children. We want them to circulate more, we want them to have opportunities, and so on. So whereas I would keep the basic structure of the policy, intact, but I would have to relook into the issues that have come up historically. How do we get back our African languages sensibly into our school curriculum? Because it is important for us to do this. How do we at the same time sustain the growth of the idea of the Kenyan nation so that we minimize the troublesome distractions that come with over-identification with, these languages and ethnic groups and so on? That would be my challenge. And just now I'm not thinking very clearly, but I know that at the end of the discussion that we are part of, my ideas will be clearer. When it comes to the so-called international languages, I would leave things as they are for the moment, but encourage more directly the teaching and learning of other languages, Chinese, German, French, so that our people are enabled to circulate more in this world, because it's becoming quite obvious that their circulation is so important to the economy of the country. Ultimately, all this comes back to education for what? My ideas on language will try to fit into some general theory on why we must have a national curriculum. Thank you.
First, if the Minister of Education of an African country came to me for help developing a language policy in the education system, I'd be honored. But I don't think I'd be able to help. I don't have the expertise or training for such work. And if I'm honest, the idea of language policies scares me a little. Partly this is because of how resonant Ngugi wa Thiong'o's discussion of his experience of such policies in Decolonizing the Mind was when I first read it as an undergraduate many years ago, and even is now today. Partly it's because the effects of 1930s and 1940s British colonial language policies upon the world of Swahili literature, especially Swahili poetry, are something I think about a lot. The way colonial standardization of Swahili made it hard to publish the tradition of Swahili poetry, because that poetry was seen to be in not the right kind of Swahili. Actually, a work of Ngugi's and his colleagues that I read today with my students on the abolition of the English department is, in a sense, an antidote to the situation Decolonizing the Mind narrates. So it's not that I think there can't be good policies, but I'm not a person for formulating them. Still, if the minister had a moment, I'd make a request. It would be that everyone involved with making a new language policy read and listen to some poems. Ideally, poems in all the languages involved in the language policy, even related to that policy. Perhaps everyone could learn a poem by heart. This, I think, would be a great preparation for thinking about language policy. I think that poetry articulates its own language policies when we attend to it. And I think the language policies of poetry can inform language policies of the more administrative kind. And this is not to exclude prose fiction. I want to add some hadithi, some stories. Those would be good for the language policy makers too. But poetry is where I would start.
Idan ministan ilimin wata ƙasar Afirka ya tambaye ni akan dokoki ko tsare-tsaren koyon harshe, zan so in ga an faɗaɗa hanyoyin koyon harsunan Afirka. Akwai haushi matuƙa ganin yadda ake yin watsi da harsunan Afirka kuma ake koyar da yara wasu harsunan waje. Wannan yana da illoli ƙwarai da gaske. Yana ɗaya daga cikinsu shine yadda yara ke tashi suna tunani da harshen suna haihuwa kuma suna magana da wani harshe. Daga ƙarshe ba su Afirka kuma ba su ƙasashen waɗannan baƙin harsuna. Dabara ta farko ita ce a koyar da yara da harsunansu na haihuwa tun daga ajin firamare na 1 har zuwa aji na 4. Daga nan sai a surka da wasu harsunan. Wannan zai sanya yara su sami ilimi da fahimtar rayuwa da harsunansu na haihuwa. Zai kuma yi masu tubalin tunani da bayyana fahimtarsu ba tare da dambarwa ba. Daga aji 1 na sakandare har zuwa aji na ƙarshe, aji 6 misali a Najeriya, zan so a riƙa koya wa ɗalibai wasu harsuna da ke maƙwabtaka da su. Wato su koyi harsunan kusa da su domin fahimtar masu harshen da za ta haifar da yarda da aminta da juna da kawo zaman lafiya. Wannan kuma zai taimaka matuƙa wajen rage gaba da aka gina tsakanin mutane da dama a cikin ƙasashen Afirka. Abin takaici ne matuƙa kaga mutane suna jin harshen nahiyar Turai amma san ba su fahimtar kalmar zo a wani harshen ƙasarsu ta Afirka wanda ke maƙwabtaka da su. Yanzu lalacewar har ta kai wasu yaran na rasa harshensu na haihuwa saboda fifiko da aka baiwa harsunan Turai. Daga ƙarshe dai shawarwarina za su kasance masu sauƙi. A sanyawa a koyi harsunan Afirka na asali a shekarun farko na makaranta sai kuma a haɗa da wasu maƙwabtakan harsuna. Wannan zai taimaka ƙwarai wajen farfaɗo da harsunan Afirka da ke mutuwa yanzu.
If the Minister of Education in Kenya asked me to help develop a new language policy in the education system, I would respond with a resounding and an emphatic yes. The issue of language and language policy in education has for a long time been a tricky one, especially for African countries that were once colonized. There is a misguided belief among elite policymakers that the language of the colonizer is best placed to capture the content of the curriculum. This has over the years resulted in poor uptake of the content by the learners. Worse still is the deprivation of the opportunity for the learners to pursue formal education in the languages they understand best. This is what my policy recommendations would seek to address. The World Bank, in one of its policy papers, cites research that had proven that when children are first taught in a language that they speak and understand well, they learn more and are better placed to learn other languages, are more likely to stay in school and enjoy a school experience appropriate to their culture and local circumstances. My policy recommendations would draw on the need to look at language not just as a medium of communication or of instruction and learning, but as an integral part of the identity of the learners. I would advocate for the use of L1 languages as the medium of instruction in lower levels of learning, and by these I would acknowledge the dynamism and cosmopolitan nature of societies in African countries, more so in urban areas. The first language in question would either be the native language spoken by the community or the language of wider communication in a specific area. This, for a country like Kenya, would just be a reintroduction of the once in place language policy. The second language, which would be either a national language or a foreign language, would be introduced as a taught subject after proper grounding in the first language, and at higher grades would replace the first language as the medium of instruction. Overall, I would be keen to ensure that the first language, or the native language as the case may be, continues to be given enough space within the curriculum throughout the learning cycle.
I would accept an offer to assist in developing a new language policy in Nigeria. The existing policy is yet to be fully implemented owing to some challenges, which include the ambiguities in the provision, the sensitive as well as political nature of language matters in linguistically diverse Nigeria. The language provision of the existing national policy on education in Nigeria states that every child should be taught in his or her mother tongue or the language of the immediate environment for the first 3 years of elementary education. One of the acclaimed objectives of the policy is to support the use and development of indigenous languages in Nigeria. The policy takes cognizance of the numerous benefits of mother tongue education, especially at the early grade levels, in building the literacy and numeracy skills in school children. However, the implementation appears to favor very few indigenous languages in Nigeria, especially the major languages. For example, in Northwest, Northeast, North Central Nigeria, Hausa is recognized as the LIE. This is at the detriment of the several indigenous languages in the zone. In Southwest and some parts of South-South Nigeria, Yoruba is identified as the LIE, while in Southeast and some parts of South-South, Igbo is the LIE. It is only in some parts of North Central and Northeast Nigeria that Hausa is not the LIE. Equally, in some South-South communities, the issue of LIE remains unresolved. It becomes important to note that the use of the 3 major languages in Nigeria as LIE has not in any way encouraged the use and balanced development of several other indigenous languages in Nigeria, especially in the educational system. Hence, there is need for a new policy which will assign roles to all indigenous languages in Nigeria to ensure balanced development of the languages. One of the new strategies I would suggest in the new policy would be the use of translanguaging in Nigerian classrooms. Again, I would suggest that in place of early transition from the use of indigenous languages as a language of learning and teaching in Nigeria, late transition would be more productive. Late transition involves the use of indigenous languages for the 6 years of primary education. This policy would facilitate the use and balanced development of all indigenous languages in Nigeria. It will also provide opportunity for school children to gain adequate proficiency in their mother tongue as they use their mother tongue as the language of learning and teaching, especially in basic education in Nigeria's school system.
In Kenya, we have 2 languages, which are Kiswahili and English as the official languages of instruction in the school system. However, I would encourage the use of more languages, more African languages spoken in Kenya in the education system. That way the students and the teachers have more of a choice. And in the same way, we can also celebrate the multilingual nature of our situation in Kenya.
If the Minister of Education in Cameroon comes and seeks for my help to put in some language policies in place, first and foremost, I will accept the offer to help because this is an opportunity I think I've been waiting for. A situation where people's ideologies about the language policy of the country could be asked. So if it shows up, why wouldn't I want to take it? So when I take it, the area where I want to touch first is this area where some languages are being discouraged by making the speakers feel inferior. I want to put a policy in place where every language is being encouraged so that every speaker feel confident in his or her language. The difference will be what language will be spoken where, what language is needed where. Every language will be important, every language will be needed, but then they could have their place where they could be spoken or could be used, which is the normal phenomenon with language. Not every language is used in every area. So why not the case of Cameroon? I want a situation where about 270-something languages, local languages of Cameroon will not be discouraged like it's been discouraged nowadays. Students will not be punished for using pidgin. Students will not be punished for using these local languages and being asked to be limited only to English and French, which are the languages of the colonial masters. On the contrary, they will have a choice, a freedom of choice, what language they want to use. Speakers should be the one to choose what language to be used. So my new language policy will be a case where there will be freedom of language use. Every other language will be made to have the quality, to have the value it deserves. And a situation where other language policy makers will not be intruding in people's choices of language. So I think it will be such a great opportunity if the Minister of Education even asks me to offer help in the area of language policy. And I would gladly take it in order to effect some of those changes.
Those were the responses we received from our contributors this month. What do you think about their thoughts? Did they come up with well-developed plans for linguistic policy changes? Do you agree or disagree with aspects of the policies they suggested? Tell us about it in the comments below. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Afrikanists Assemble. We post a new episode every month, so be sure to subscribe to see what other subjects we take on in the realm of African languages and literatures.
Shamba la Mawe, yeah.